Good afternoon, everybody. This is James Gom at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us this afternoon for this webinar on business and human rights. We'd like to get started now, so thank you all for taking the time. It's 3 o'clock Geneva time, and we'll run for about 1 hour. Hopefully we'll keep this as an interactive session with lots of scope for you to ask questions. But without further ado, I'd like to get the meeting up and running. So just in terms of the agenda for today, I'll kick off with a very quick introduction as to what we're hoping to cover in this session and a little bit of background on WBCSD's business and human rights work generally, for those of you who are new to the work stream. Then I'm pleased to be handing over to Steve Gibbons to talk some details on the developments in the business and human rights landscape. And then we'll have some comments and Q&A and look to wrap up around about 4 o'clock Central European time. So just a bit of detail on WBCSD's human rights and business program. We currently sit within the people work stream of WBCSD. So this was a new structure that was implemented in WBCSD towards the end of last year, sort of streamlining our general outlook in terms of where the work sits. We now sit across these 5 key systemic areas of cities and mobility, energy and circular economy, food, land and water, people, and redefining value. And our people program obviously intersects with all the other programs quite a lot, but the main 3 key program areas of focus are social impact, sustainable lifestyles, and SDGs, and our human rights work sits under our social impact pillar. Just a little overview in terms of personnel and who's involved in our human rights work. So you're hearing my voice. I'm currently in a dual function of looking at our SDG work and running some of the human rights work. I've really been taking up the human rights work in the last few months because my colleague Katrona has been away on maternity leave, but she's I'm very pleased to say she's back with us now. She's sitting next to me here today in Geneva.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Katrona. And so Katrona will really be taking the reins again on the human rights work from now on, together with my colleague Davide. And then across the wider people program, we have my colleague Julian, who sits in sustainable lifestyles, myself and Uta, who operate on the SDG side, under our managing director, Filippo Baglio. And what we try to achieve really across the human rights work stream, as well as adhering to the general value offering of WBCSD of value, impact, and voice, providing companies with all of those 3 pillars. The 4 key areas of activity which we focus on, firstly around inspiring and informing and advocating business action around business and human rights, so making a strong business case for why companies should be involved in this area and laying out best practice in terms of what they should really be doing. Then working to bring companies together through peer learning, webinars such as this, and other opportunities to highlight that best practice and disseminate solutions at a practical working level. And then hopefully bringing companies together to kick off work streams and new projects that are really going to help streamline some of those efforts and create more impact on the ground. And in the case of business and human rights, create more value for people, create real impact on the communities and individuals that are currently don't have access to the same levels of lifestyle that we would deem desirable. And on the voice side, WBCSD has UN consultative status, and we look to input into the various negotiations that are happening here in Geneva at UN level, feeding back to you as members the development of those conversations and putting your feedback into various processes such as those around the UN Treaty on business and human rights, which is still ongoing, and the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights, which happens each year in November. All with the wider objective of operationalizing the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Just very quickly, and this kind of captures what we got up to last year and generally our approach in this area. So our activities are spread across 3 main pillars. So there's that information service fee shown by the briefings and webinars stream there at the top of the screen. There's the more sort of deep dive practical aspect of the workshops, which we started to hold last year. And then there's the UN level engagement, which I just spoke about. So you can see up at the top there, we have bi-monthly briefing notes that come out every couple of months, which hopefully all of you are already signed up to, but do let me know if you're not receiving them. I'll be happy to send them on. And we also had a number of webinars last year, taking a deep dive into various topics, from the finance perspective with JP Morgan, to looking at corporate governance and human rights, general trends, and then taking a deep dive into the Australian Modern Slavery Act late last year. The workshops were something new that we implemented last year, and these were very illuminating and seemed to go very well in terms of digging a bit deeper into some of the actual issues that people are facing with regard to human rights due diligence and reporting mostly. And we held 4 global workshops in collaboration with Shift in London, Johannesburg, New York, and Delhi, as well as a couple of roundtables here in Geneva and Montreux, just up the road, capturing some of the evolutions there. So a valuable piece of work. We've already continued this into this year. We've held workshops in Johannesburg and Mumbai already this year, and looking to put something together for Europe in the coming months. And the UN level engagement, as I mentioned, feeding into various processes that are still ongoing around the UN Forum and the treaty, and liaising regularly with the UN's Working Group on Business and Human Rights, putting a progressive business voice into that process. Just in terms of the scale of who's involved, a lot of WBCSD projects are quite narrow in terms of having a few companies really heavily involved in a project. We consider ourselves as being very, very broad, trying to incorporate the views and experiences of as many companies as possible. So we held 4 workshops last year, and they were attended by over 100 participants from 60 different companies. Likewise, our mailing list, our working group, if you like, a briefing notes sent to over 80 different companies, and our webinars attended last year from individuals from over 40 different companies. So hoping to really leverage and make the most of the wide membership that WBCSD has, to bring individuals from different sectors together to discuss common challenges and really push forward finding solutions to the various challenges that the human rights landscape throws up. One other initiative that we launched at the end of last year that I'd just like to flag is this Business and Human Rights Gateway, which is an online portal which gives member-only access to developments across the business and human rights landscape that we've captured. So we have all of our historic briefing notes and webinars and publications on this topic gathered together on this site. We also have a regularly updated latest news and insights section, which gathers key developments from across the landscape. And we've also gone through the process of listing up and summarizing over 100 key resources, tools, and reports that can be filtered in terms of a particular human rights issues. So they can, for example, if you're looking for information on ways to tackle child labor in the supply chain, you can filter by child labor, or you can filter by different aspects of human rights due diligence if you're looking for guidance on how to develop a policy or how to report more effectively. Again, these are filters that you can use through the system. So we're very pleased to share this with you. It's not up on our publicly available website because we're keeping it as a member-only resource, with a view to sharing all of these webinars that remain for members only. But please do take a note of the URL and the password there, and I'll be happy to share the link with you afterwards as well. So segueing now into the real meat of today's discussion, we thought it useful at this stage, still relatively early in the year, although the year is fast disappearing, to have a bit of a catch up and generally to look forward in terms of the key issues that are emerging on the business and human rights landscape for the year. It's a very fast moving space, as all of us know, constantly lots of developments happening, whether it's new pieces of legislation, new technology that's making, or it's helping to evolve human rights due diligence, or whether it's new tools and resources. We captured, and I've shared this graphic a lot of times now for those of you that have seen it before, but we've captured this idea of the big bang around the UN Guiding Principles that you can see there in the middle of this diagram. And since they came out in 2011, this universe has really exploded with a series of different developments both on the regulatory side, on the left-hand side of the semicircle, and the action side on the right-hand side of the semicircle, with new pieces, new joint platforms, new benchmarks, new guidelines, etc., coming out to support business. But then on the left-hand side, new pieces of legislation and national action plans to incentivize business and push business towards taking more action on the human rights side. So it's a very complex space, and we're very pleased today to have Steve from Ergon Associates with us to give us his perspectives on what are some of the key issues that he's seeing moving forward, key topics to watch out for, key pieces of advice for us as we head into the rest of 2018, and give us some key insights there. So I invite Steve now to talk to us for the next half hour or so on his views, and we'll have a little bit of Q&A afterwards. If, while Steve is speaking, any questions pop up, please do pop them into the Q&A section. There's in the top left-hand side of your screen, there should be a little Q&A button. So please do write them down, and I'll collect them all up, and at the end of the session we can put them to Steve and ask for his thoughts and feedback. So that's all from me. I'll hand over to Steve now, and thank you very much, Steve.
Thanks very much, James. And it looks like, first of all, I've broken the first rule of webinars, that there appears to be no technical problems. So that looks good to start with. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this today. And what I'm going to do really, and I may take half an hour, I may take slightly less than that, is to go through a number of the issues as we see them from the perspective of our consulting and research practice. So it's probably worth very briefly, first of all, sort of explaining a little bit who Ergon are. Now, we're a consultancy that was founded 13 years ago, working broadly on business and human rights. And as far as our clients are concerned, which kind of explains a little bit where we're coming from, we do work with a number of multi-stakeholder initiatives, industry initiatives, but we also work directly with a whole range of multinational companies, but also with development and project financiers as well. So from the perspective of the emerging business human rights world over the last decade, we've seen this coming from the perspective of garment supply chains, but also from the financing of large-scale infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what we do. That's the blurb at the start there. But what I want to do really during the course of the next sort of 20-25 minutes or so is go through what we see in terms of what's new, if you like, and what's driving some change. How are private sector companies and financiers changing, and also civil society more generally, and government too, as far as James put it, the Big Bang, as the UNGPs start to seem to be having a greater degree of influence, and what are the things that cause that change, and where do we want to be at the end of that? So in a really kind of a bit of a scattergun approach on this is that I'm going to go through some examples and issues and take that through. So first of all, this is our sort of timeline, which is nowhere near as fancy looking as the sort of the Big Bang sort of circles that James gave, which I feel totally compelled to steal after this presentation, or borrow rather. Our timeline there looks back to 2011, and obviously 2011 we saw the UNGPs were unanimously adopted or approved rather by the United Nations, and pretty quickly after then we saw a revision to the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, more of which later. Also, the same year we saw the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act, and then we saw in 2013 the first National Action Plan, as we saw on James's Big Bang graphic there. There's now, I think it's about 21 National Action Plans on business and human rights, and there's about another 20 that are in formation one way or another. And this is obviously where governments commit to what they're doing, both in terms of their own legislation, but also the promotion of the UNGPs. So the EU Directive on Non-Financial Reporting early on there. And then as far as government initiatives, and I'll come back to this, not only because it's something that we do a lot of work on, which wouldn't surprise you as we're headquartered in the United Kingdom, but also because I think it has interesting lessons for all of us is the UK's Modern Slavery Act. Then we're seeing a range of benchmarks, which I think, again, are very, very important in the terms of both Know the Change, Dow Jones Sustainability Indexes revisions, which included human rights due diligence criteria in 2015, and the corporate human rights benchmark. We've seen one iteration and we're about to see a second iteration. And then I think there's more legislation coming through, the French Devoir de Vigilance, but also a range of other, there's more to come on this, legislation, including Dutch child labour law on due diligence, Swiss Corporate Responsibility Initiative, and Australian modern slavery legislation. Now, I think it's probably fair to say, and there's a lot more that we could put onto this chart, is that certainly from our perspective, is that back in 2011 and for a number of subsequent years, outside the small world of business and human rights sort of geeks, there was really not a huge amount of traction. And if you look back to issues, for example, the UK National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, there probably wasn't a lot of action or a lot of a plan in that. Now, I think the second version is better, but it was merely really a restatement of what government was already doing. Now, this is partly because I think these things take a while to embed in, but also because it took quite a long time for both policy frameworks and legislative frameworks and companies themselves to actually get what was really meant at the heart of the due diligence approach, what was expected by it. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And I think one useful example on that is, and we'll return a bit in a moment, is the Ethical Trading Initiative, which is a multi-stakeholder group on business and human rights. It's probably the oldest. It was founded in 1998, focusing on labour rights issues, which for really essentially 2 decades was focused on a compliance and audit approach, even though it tried to do a lot more than that, but has recently readjusted its approach and put out both in terms of its own membership reporting and expectations, but also as a framework which is much more aligned to the concepts of policy, risk assessment, action, collaboration, and monitoring review that is really the wheel, the heart of the UNGP's approach. And we'll come back to that in a moment as well. So just for reminding us all, I'm sure we're all on this call reasonably familiar, but just to remind that as far as the UNGPs are concerned, they're essentially 3 pillars. And it's always worth remembering this in terms of the state duty to protect human rights, companies' responsibility to respect, and the shared responsibility for access to remedy through judicial, non-judicial and grievance mechanisms. Now, obviously, as far as the company responsibility, there are really 3 core elements, and we can unpack this a bit more, but in terms of policy statements, due diligence and remediation. Now, for the first sort of phase of UNGPs, we saw a lot of development of policy, and there's nothing wrong with a policy, but a policy without an action plan and without due diligence really doesn't take you very far. And I think we saw a number of instances where that was the case. But I think what's really interesting as far as state duties are concerned is that we've seen, obviously, a state within its own jurisdiction is obliged to introduce legislation which protects human rights. I think one of the interesting points as far as recent developments are concerned comes not so much from that and not so much from procurement rules, because in terms of state spending and incorporation into business and human rights principles into that, again, I think we've seen a lot less progress than we would think. But more is the issue of reporting and reporting requirements. And we've seen a number on the previous slide that I stated there, but I'm just going to pull it back to that actually. But if we look at the Modern Slavery Act, just very briefly on here, is that, and I think it's surprised us with the work that we've been doing with companies on this, is that how much the mere fact that a company has to capture and write down what it is doing on a particular issue. And this is aligned, remember, the Modern Slavery Act very much with the UN Guiding Principles. But then I think crucially and equally important, that statement has to be passed to somebody very senior at board level. And that person, for example, if they're UK incorporated, and obviously not all of the companies have to be UK incorporated by any means at all, but a UK company law applies, or their own host state company law applies with regard to directors' duties. And that particular duty there that's relevant is that he or she signing that statement has to the best of their ability, be clear that that statement is accurate. And what we've seen with a number of clients is that when the draft modern slavery statement has gone to board level, there's been a kind of level of scrutiny, but also potentially really, really good questioning of how much the risk assessment process, how much the focus, how much the action is both relevant and the right thing for the company to do, coming from very senior people in the company. And that has a number of times has led to increases in budgets. Sometimes it leads to a sort of a stripping out of the statement and it becoming a bit bland, but quite often not. And I think I'll come back to some examples on that. It really is the reporting element that this potentially drives more than you could think. And certainly working around both of the three benchmarks at the bottom of that slide as well with clients, we've seen that there's been progress achieved because you are going to have to report to a benchmarker, and that will affect your standing. In some companies, as we all know, that really has a big driving effect. And so I think we see the reporting element of this as being something that has really sort of upped the game, upped the pressure, and in many ways upped companies' performance on these issues. So these are some of the drivers that we've seen behind. What we wanted to do as far as just to map this, and we thought of used these three. Apologies that they're all London based, but that's where we sit. But I think they're all of sort of international relevance for there. Is that as far as the broader sort of components that we put within the UNGPs, we add stakeholder engagement at the bottom because we think you can't do this without that. All of them deal obviously with policy and government's due diligence process, risk assessment, action, and monitoring. And we must always remember that due diligence has to be all three of those. The ETI framework and the benchmarks that we're looking at on there, the CHRB, they look at remediation as well. And both of those also expect some degree of stakeholder engagement and collaboration. So I think you'll see from those, and the UK Modern Slavery Act, for a very issue-specific piece of legislation, something that was put together very quickly on the back of other legislation, really covers a lot of those points. But we're seeing the requirement to report, and this will continue as we see with emerging other reporting frameworks as well, and also emerging expectations from lenders as well, those of you who actually sort of are either financed directly or through sort of institutional other investees. These issues is not just saying, do you have a policy, but more, how do you know what your risks are and what action have you taken in response to it? This is what we see as the emerging drive that's going through here. So this is just sort of breaking down a little bit more, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but you'll see as far as the corporate human rights benchmark is that there's a very defined scoring process that goes through there, and weighted scoring process across governance, sort of embedding, remedies, performance, response to serious allegations, and transparency. And another issue that's emerging here, I think it's very, very clear, is that as benchmarks drive things, and they're not the only things that drive changes, and a number of companies are necessarily because of their corporate structure or holding immune from this, but lots of companies, and certainly a number that we've worked with, have seen a great benefit from being much more transparent on these issues. And we'll see it, for example, in the press once again, the fact that Nestle and some of the cocoa and other chocolate companies are much more transparent now about acknowledging the risks and realities of their supply chains. And certainly modern slavery driven, but other issues driven as well, is that, you know, if you are in the infrastructure business and you're operating in the Gulf states, and that's somewhere which we work, denying the fact that there is an issue or not being open to the fact that there's an issue as far as recruitment fees, passport retention, and a whole range of issues around contracted labour, is you're only kind of kidding yourself and kidding your key stakeholders. You're better off just being transparent and open and saying there is a risk, this is what we're doing about it. So here are some of the issues I think that we're seeing companies asking, those ones who are moving into sort of, you know, mid-upper to leadership levels as far as human rights due diligence are concerned. First of all, as far as due diligence, what do you cover? So increasingly, what we're seeing is, and I'll take the example of retailers with sort of extended supply chains, is of course they'll be looking at the core products that they're selling and iconic products that they're selling and what the sort of human rights and other risks are related to that, what they do, but also increasingly they're looking at issues like logistics. Yeah, if you're an e-retailer, probably the most salient and closest issue to you as far as human rights issues may actually not be an extended factory where you have a very, very small take in terms of purchase, but it may be in your developed economy markets where you're operating, the labour and other human rights conditions related to the delivery of the product that you're selling. So this scoping issue, similarly, you know, what about the people who clean your offices? What about security? There's a whole range of broader due diligence issues, which I think sort of taking that retail supply chain that people are realizing, well, saliency could take us to that more so than other issues. Next issues, I think, are that we're seeing as far as how do you get some focus and priority, because obviously the challenge is the wider you cast your net in terms of human rights due diligence and issues, what do you focus on? How do you get to that? Then we're seeing who do you talk to? What information do you need? Now, just as we do and Veritas Maplecroft and a whole range of other people produce risk-based information, there's also no substitution for the fact of talking to people who are in a country, and they can be within your company, they can be other companies, they can be civil society. How do we get better information? And that includes, and I'll come back to this, direct information from communities and workers as well. It seems a crucial thing for movement on this that is happening much more now is taking this issue out of the silo, because in many ways, particularly on, I think, supply chain labour rights issues, the issue had become incredibly siloed and audit driven. I think it's really fair to say. And the question is, how do you get senior people on board and the right people on board? And we've seen, certainly with a number of our clients who have now got cross-company human rights working groups who involve commercial, legal, corporate comms, IT, property, a whole range of people, not just the traditional supply chain people or the traditional sustainability sort of departments that are in there. The issue of what you report and how you report is a really crucial one that we're seeing coming forward on there. And also what role audits and assessment, because we see some companies who essentially, for example, in Chinese factories, who have started dispensing with audits and going straight to action. So if you know year after year you send an auditor and the auditor comes back to you and tells you that there's a long working hours problem in this factory, and then you send the auditor next year and they tell you there's a long working hours problem in the factory, where does it take you? So there's a number of companies which are now just going straight to the factory and saying, we assume there is a long working hours problem in this factory. We don't need to audit that. We want you to tell us what you're doing and we will start monitoring you against action rather than compliance, which I think takes you to a much more healthy place long term. And the final point, what real impact do we think we're having on people? Because certainly from oil and gas and extractives, it's much easier to see what the impacts are on people from human rights and other programs and social impact programs, partly because the standard impact assessment and community engagement methodologies and the close footprint of the project are clear. In broader spread businesses with complex value chains, that's much harder. And compliance doesn't tend to tell you anything about impact. it could be a proxy, but not also. So we're seeing a lot of more thought on those issues. Okay, I just want to give two examples here. So as far as the broader impact of looking at human rights scoping and due diligence. Now, the one on the right is one that may be familiar to many of you, and that's the fact that as a result of various sort of exposés and dreadful situations, most obviously Burmese migrant people working on fishing boats in the waters off Thailand, who are held in dreadful situations where people for years won't get off the boat. There's been a realization that something has to be done, and that isn't simply a matter of just looking for first-tier assessment or auditing or compliance, because the real problems that are behind that issue, and quite often the fish that they will be fishing will not be the shrimp that people will be eating in Europe or elsewhere, but they will be fish that is fed to shrimp in farms and goes through several tiers. It's something that needs to be worked at by a collaborative effort, and we're seeing really interesting collaborative efforts there between government, international organizations and business. On a difficult issue, it's very hard for a business on their own to fix it, and we need to acknowledge that more. But here's another issue that we've had come out with a couple of our clients when we've been looking at logistics, is that the human rights impacts aren't always the ones that may seem obvious to you. So you may say that if you're looking at logistics, the human rights impact issues, when you do an assessment, would be on, for example, drivers' working practices. And that's not to say there's a problem. We came across recently drivers living in Murcia in Spain, traveling to Northern Europe, who had no home address. They had no home address. They just lived in their lorries all the time. Now, the human rights consequences of not having an address and the personal consequences are really quite significant. And once the company started looking at that, they realized that they had to work to provide accommodation and shared accommodation for drivers, because the consequence of in terms of bank accounts, in terms of stability, in terms of a whole range of issues were really much greater than they thought. But then the other issue is, of course, we've had this with another number of clients where branded vehicles are a very, very attractive mode of transport for people traffickers, who will pay money and will receive lots of money to potentially use your vehicles to traffic super vulnerable people from one country to another. And I think it's that realization of what the potential impacts are that are really starting to become much clearer. So very, very briefly, because I'm aware on time here, is that what we're also seeing is a better way in terms of actually unpacking what saliency really means. And so not just looking at here's a risk assessment in terms of, this country is all red, or this is a particular sort of risk broadly, but really focusing on what you do as a business, what the likely rights holders might be impacted by your activities. And that activities, the example I give there is it could be logistics, and the rights holders could be obviously the drivers, but it could be people who are trafficked in your lorry, but also with road transport, one of the biggest sort of human rights impacts are road accidents on pedestrians, which we shouldn't forget, and looking at all of those as potential impacts on there. Then is looking at, what your methodology is to assess your saliency. There's lots of different ways, and I'll throw out some in a moment, that are emerging now how to better do that. Because again, if you treat every single risk the same, you will end up potentially doing nothing. Or you'll just end up with a blanket approach, audit everything or apply policy to everything. How do you focus? How do you get there? How do you map that against your leverage? And crucially, how do you prioritize? So here's just a few, and these are our ones, so I apologize for this there. Some different ways that certainly as far as risk tools and prioritization, we're seeing a much emerging approach across a range of, and this is not just us, a range of people looking at, well, can you risk score, and saying in relation to logistics, can we get a methodology to score what our impacts will be? Can we do that in terms of site level assessment, rather than just having everything flat, saying, well, where is the higher risk in terms of saliency, which must mean likelihood mapped against severity, but then also perhaps adding as well what remediability looks like for those. So there's lots of different ways this can be done, but I think the key thing is to get to a focus and say, we are focusing, for example, in this country on this action and this activity and this rights holder group, because this is where the relevant issues are, and drive that through to your action. The next sort of very briefly issue that I want to just throw out there is that, and I think that there was obviously the last UN forum was intended to focus on the issue of grievance, but we are still seeing quite a way to go in terms of effective grievance mechanisms that really get to the heart of the issue as far as human rights are concerned, and also lead to some degree of remediation. Because a key thing about a grievance mechanism that stands as such is that a hotline where somebody tells you something is part of your due diligence. But a grievance mechanism allows you to feedback, roll back, and actually say, well, we can do something about this. So I think increasingly we're seeing greater approaches to do this. We're seeing lots of claims being made by tech-based solutions, for example, as far as workers and communities are concerned. But certainly, to be honest and fair, I think there's still a long way to go in terms of seeing approaches which can be genuinely sort of characterized as leading to remedy and engaging the people who make the complaint in finding out what the outcome is. Now, when we've been involved in it, we've always seen it as a very positive thing, both for the organisation and those people impacted. But the key thing is it takes a lot of time, a lot of resource, and a lot of energy. I said there was no technical problem, but now I can't move the slide on. There we go. I think some other issues, just very briefly, that that we put out that we're seeing coming through for the next year is as far as blockchain and broader technology. Now, I think potentially as far as traceability and quite complex solutions to complex problems, blockchain could have lots and lots of supporting answers. I mean, take for the example, and there's a few people working on this, where on migrant workers, you could use blockchain to anonymously track the worker and his or her sort of journey to the job, in both in geographical journey but also stages of recruitment process. Now that also gives rise to all sorts of privacy issues we need to deal with as well. But similarly, as far as technology, as far as issues, and sticking for a moment on the supply chain labour analysis, is that provision with sign-off from workers of wages and hours records could be done through technology in a way whereby there was automatic visibility throughout the supply chain, in a way that if you took all of the money that's spent on auditing hours and wages records and actually put some of that effort into creating this kind of system, it would be both more efficient, it would be much more direct, it would be more transparent, and would allow us to focus workplace assessment or site assessment on much more difficult to assess issues. Yeah, which also leads to the next 2 points there. I think finding a way to actually take both a gendered lens to human rights and also other lenses like child-focused lens will be more disruptive, and in some ways disruptive both agendas and technology is what we need to start making some progress on business and human rights, looking at things differently through other people's eyes, not looking down the value chain, but looking up the value chain and seeing what it looks like from the bottom, not from the power at the top. And another issue I think goes around jobs and across all sectors is that, you know, automation will lead to, you know, better jobs, hopefully, but fewer jobs. So if from a state perspective, what happens with dislocation there? And also, what about gig economy? Because there's lots of positive things about a gig economy, and in lots of emerging and developing countries, the gig economy is the economy. But what about, it's more in those transition from more regulated economies into less regulated, how that's dealt with. We see that as a big challenge issue for the next 12 months or so. Okay, and I'll just briefly conclude on by looking at how far things have come on something certainly, and it's a very specific sector, but it's a sector we're working on a lot at the moment. You look at the fact with, just take the FIFA World Cup and take that as an example of a human rights issue. Now, all of you be familiar with issues around stadium construction, other issues both in Russia and Qatar for the 2018 and 2022 World Cups. Now, where things have come in relation to all of those, actually, and take Qatar as an example, is that we perhaps couldn't have predicted so much, but due to lots of pressure and external pressure, but also is a willingness to move to a certain degree by the Qataris in the Supreme Committee that is responsible for the World Cup. We now have joint stadium monitoring with an international trade union. We have independent monitoring by Impact in the centre there, but we've also seen law change in recent months. And I think that's partly because, like I say, of commitments from FIFA and from Qatar and incredible work from lots of civil society. But also, to a certain extent, by taking a UNGP's approach, which has allowed people not to talk about compliance, but talk about change and gradual process. Now, this has also led, and certainly we've just finished working on and is being submitted this week, and it will be public, so I can say, is worked with the US, Canada and Mexico World Cup bid for the first World Cup bid that has to comply with new FIFA requirements, which have to have an independent human rights report, but also have to have a published risk assessment on human rights, but crucially, a strategy about what they're going to do about human rights issues there, and also stakeholder engagement. Now, this is perfectly aligned with the UNGPs. It's a really interesting approach, but it's a long way. It really is quite astonishing, certainly when we worked on London 2012, how far things have come and how quickly suddenly they're moving. And on the broader issues, just to leave you with the two gentlemen at the bottom there, with their own particular sort of take on this as far as human rights, is that we're not just talking about, football stadiums and workers, about sort of sport and business and human rights, is that we see with Pep Guardiola there wearing a yellow ribbon, which he wears in protest to political prisoners or Catalan prisoners who organised a referendum in Spain. And we see Thomas Hitzlberger, who will be going to Russia as the official diversity ambassador for German football this summer, who is one of the first clearly openly sort of out gay male football players. Now, in both of those issues, we suddenly see a whole range of human rights issues, not that we've got to get our heads round and we've got to get a strategy for. But the key thing is, I use this as an example because if FIFA can get there and be very public there in a relatively short period of time, I think there's many other sectors that are already performing well. You can expect you're going to have to go further. Okay.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. That was very comprehensive, but also concise overview of everything that you're seeing going on from your perspective there at Ergon. Some interesting issues to discuss. So now I'd like to throw it open to Q&A if we can. So please invite you all to share any questions or comments, whether there's anything else on your agenda for the coming months that you think would be critical to your efforts in working to mainstream human rights due diligence. We have one question that's come in already through the chat from Dabrovka, asking about benchmarking. So noting that the CHRB currently focuses on only 3 industries, and whether we have any insights on plans to expand the coverage of either the CHRB or if there are any other benchmarks, and she specifically is asking around the pharma industry. So whether there are any other pharma-related benchmarks or plans to add pharma to the CHRB. So from my side, I haven't heard of any developments from the pharma side on CHRB, but I wonder if you have any insights, Steve.
What I understand at the moment is that there's no intention to go more broadly as far as pharma is concerned from CHRB. CHRB is It's slightly resource limited because it's resource intensive, and obviously it's funded externally. So I think as far as their donors and funders are concerned, they have some focus industries which they're going to stick with. But obviously I think the big one as far as pharma, not just pharma is there, but is actually DGSI, which again, I think the changes 2 iterations ago to DGSI of including quite defined human rights due diligence requirements or expectations in the benchmark were I think they were serious. And if you look at the scoring on that, not many companies scored very well as far as that's concerned. And I think that over time, I would have thought DGSI is one that will obviously impact not just on pharma, but pharma is one sector that's covered there. I don't know any industry specific issues as far as benchmarks concerned.
Great, thanks. I'm just waiting for a few other questions to come in. Perhaps from my side, it'd be interesting to explore a little bit around, as a consultancy dealing with these issues and advising companies, when you're looking at pieces of legislation like the Modern Slavery Act or potentially the upcoming Australian Act around modern slavery, the temptation, or how do you avoid the pitfall, I guess, of focusing, because that is a topic that's driving action within a lot of companies. So how do you tackle the issue of perhaps focusing your reaction to a piece of legislation like that, and avoiding it being narrowly focused just around the parameters of that legislation? How do you weigh that up against using that as an opportunity to drive forward, due diligence in its fuller scope, rather than just looking at the parameters of what the Modern Slavery Act requires, if that makes sense?
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. So certainly our approach always on this is to, when we work with clients, is to say, well, you have to produce this statement, but whatever sector you're in, it's highly, highly unlikely that you will have a series of activities and policies and collaborations which are solely focused on modern slavery. Now, there may be, for example, that if you are, if you're in the Gulf and you're recruiting a lot of people, there is a lot of labour activities that have modern slavery indicators related to them. So that's on recruitment fees, it's on passports, but also all those workers will have issues around working time, accommodation, safety, a whole range of other issues. So what we work with clients to say is that your response should really be a holistic one, and the activities that we identify within the companies that may have a negative impact on modern slavery, we take the opportunity and we encourage them to take the opportunity of the statement to build a broader system of control. And certainly our advice to lots of clients is look, this is maybe modern slavery now, but you can't avoid the broader human rights piece. Sooner or later, you've got to engage with that. So take this opportunity now, when you have your senior management's attention because of this piece of legislation, use it to go more broadly. Now, that's not normally a problem, because senior management get it and they say, well, surely there isn't a risk of modern slavery, and they can say, well, there might be, but it's tied up with X, Y, and Z. So that's the way we will tend to approach that. And if you read a lot of the higher, not just by us, but a whole range of other people ranked modern slavery statements, most of them the activities aren't modern slavery specific. They're saying, well, this is how we manage our supply chain, this is how we manage our contractors, this is how we manage X, Y, and Z. And then they will call out specific issues where they've identified higher risk or saliency for modern slavery. But it's very rare that it's very specific. Yeah? And neither should it be.
Perfect. And we've had another question from Moira, asking about the fact that we're seeing a lot of focus on corporate inactivity/activity around UNGPs and their operationalization, but relatively little scrutiny around state responsibilities. And do you see this changing?
It's a difficult one, I think, really. I think necessarily the focus goes on to companies, partly because that's what the narrative is as far as who is, inverted commas, responsible or at fault. But I think we have definitely seen in some countries that we will see. I think the Swiss, the Swiss vote on this is an interesting one, and also in the Netherlands, I think we've seen more focus on what the state can do. And also, I think an important one is the whole debate around the National Action Plan in Germany, which was a very long and lengthy debate. And I should have mentioned that actually, because I think the very clear state involvement and also, questions from civil society about what the German government would be doing about this has sort of driven a much higher agenda there. So I think it really depends on the narrative and the politics of the country in question. And also, but I think having seen both Modern Slavery Act, particularly the French law as well, and others, those countries which don't have a piece of legislation that forces a bit more action by companies, I think will see that. It's a necessary thing that I think that advocates and others will raise. But also I think the gap is, as far as state responsibilities, is also goes to the issue as far as protective responsibilities. And that's where I think the dynamic, for example, is interesting between international business and other stakeholders who may be going sort of in relation to a third party country and saying, well, we need you to move something on legislation, because actually without legislation there, or with legislation that blocks human rights, then the business and the companies can't fulfill their UNGP's obligations. Now, I think Qatar is one example where through a very complex series of events that's happening. We've also seen it in issues like Malawi in tea, where a group of both civil society and companies lobbied the government for an increase in the minimum wage. And in Cambodia, we've seen this a little bit as well. So I think it depends where you sit and what you're talking about. That's a bit of a lawyer's answer, but it's inevitably going to come back on the agenda, but still probably not as much as we might want it to.
Great, thanks. And a really interesting question here actually around litigation activity. So have we seen any instances of litigation activity from affected individuals or communities or whatever based on issues that have been identified in transparent human rights reporting? So I guess has reporting on issues actually led to any negatives on the litigation side?
No, I think that's a really good question, and thank you, Boris, for asking that question. Is because there is, and what we'll see sometimes is that attention, particularly from internal lawyers who will say, well, we can't disclose this risk because it would open us up to sort of potential liability for not responding to it or taking action in response to known risk. Now, that I can see the argument there, and we see a difference in US-based companies in their disclosure of human rights risk compared to other headquartered companies, to be honest on that, and I think this is a key driver. But as yet, we haven't seen any litigation that has been based on a transparent reporting and commitment from a company. And certainly, not necessarily from a litigation perspective, but from a civil society perspective, is that, for example, around Modern Slavery Act, the very strong civil society message that's been going back to, and investor message that's going back to companies, is that we will reward you for your honesty. And that is seen as a positive thing, because in some ways, if you put your challenges on the table, you're much more likely to do something about them. But there will be some circumstances where companies will say, well, no, that's not the case. And I get that as well. They'll say, we can't disclose on this and report on it till we feel that we have got a message, basically a plan and a message on this. So again, kind of 50-50 on this, probably less disclosed than disclosed, to be quite honest.
Great, thanks. Perhaps just time for one more question. This is on behalf of my colleague Davide, who's doing some work around our technology piece here at WBCSD. But the tech and human rights space, so lots of technology, blockchain in particular, often being hailed as a save-all solution in the transparency and due diligence space. How far off do you think we are from technologies like that being able to really be implemented and to help the process? And B, are there any other technologies that you think would be good to highlight in terms of moving the space forward?
Yep. Okay. So I think two things really is that I think the technology is here, but you've got to use it for the right thing. Okay, so I think technology to say, you know, it is a solution for this is a it depends on the issue, but I think that's overstating the case. I think we could use the technology better to provide better risk information, real-time information as far as actually what's happening on the ground, either from communities. And we've seen this for a long time with oil and gas, you know, the fact that if there's a spill in the Niger Delta, you know, a community can take a smartphone and geotag and take that photo straight away. That is not difficult. Yeah. I think some of the worker-based interviewing technology is perhaps a little bit overstated at the moment, but that's not saying it's not useful, because I think if you're still stuck in the compliance mode, it is not going to tell you the answer on that, because nothing really is. But if you say, well, actually, it can tell us a little bit more about, you know, worker sentiment, about, you know, it can tell you the percentage of workers who paid recruitment fees. Like on a community, you know, if you're saying, well, are we really consulting with the community as we expect to? It can tell you what the community's feeling is on that. And that can either be by specific technology, or it could be as well in different, certainly in some geographical regions, there are communities and workers and others talk on social media. And certainly on a project I've been working on in Latin America is that, which is a big infrastructure project, you get more information from looking at indigenous communities' Twitter accounts and Facebook feeds than you do from paid for consultants who go in the field. And to me, that has been a really great learning experience, because the communities report direct and send the photos. Whereas the consultants, as skilled as they are, have difficulty getting into the community, and also their picture is slightly different. Now, so my point is here, what technology can do is give us a wide range of information and inputs. What it can't do is find us the answers. Yeah, the companies still have to work themselves to get that and say, what are we responsible for? What is our response? Yeah. So one final thing where I think it's going on there is that, and this is a broader human rights perspective, I think if you look at the work that has been done around, you know, the dreadful situations been happening in Myanmar as far as the Rohingya is concerned, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty worked with satellite imaging companies to see exactly what was happening in real time in terms of people movement. And I think some of the lessons from that are really, you know, really quite striking as far as big footprint impact projects, as far as human rights and some environmental damage is concerned.
Wonderful, great, thank you. And thank you, that's a tough question to throw you right at the last minute. But thanks so much, that's wonderful. I think we're probably just about out of time. Working in Switzerland, constantly reminded of the importance of finishing bang on time. But just a quick wrap up from my side to thank Steve for sharing his insights today. You can see Steve's contact details there, and I'm sure he'd be very happy to carry on any other conversations offline. And we will make these slides and a recording of today's session available after the event. So thank you again for your time, and we look forward to catching up with those of you who are going to be in Montreux in a few weeks' time. And if not, we look forward to being in touch via our next briefing in a few weeks. So thank you very much, and thank you, Steve.
Thank you.